The year is 1943. In a quiet village cemetery in central Ukraine, an old woman places flowers on a grave that has no name, only a number. She comes every spring, always alone. The priest no longer asks why. He knows she will never tell. She is 92 now, but 70 years ago, she was 22, and she carried secrets that still wake her at night. Her name was Hannah. In the summer of 1941, when the Germans rolled through her village like a steel storm, she made a choice that would haunt 3 generations. The official Soviet history later called her a heroine of the underground. The Germans called her a bandit. Her neighbors, when they dared speak at all, called her something far worse. But Hannah was never alone in her silence. Across the front lines, thousands carried the same weight. Men and women whose stories were buried deeper than the bodies in the ravines. Some were erased because they embarrassed Moscow. Some because they embarrassed Berlin. Many simply because no one survived to tell them. This is not the war you were taught. In the forests of Belarus, a Red Army lieutenant named Mikhail Volkov deserted in the winter of 1942, not out of cowardice, but because he discovered his own unit had orders to shoot retreating soldiers, orders signed by Stalin himself. He lived with partisans for 2 years. Then, when the tide turned, he put his uniform back on and rejoined the advance, as if nothing had happened. He was awarded the Order of the Red Banner in 1945. He never told his wife. When he died in 1989, his grandson found a German paybook hidden in the lining of an old coat. Mikhail had been paid by the WWII for information that saved an entire partisan detachment from encirclement. He betrayed the Germans to save his own people. The paybook was burned the same night it was found. The family never spoke of it again. Far to the south, in occupied Crimea, a Tatar schoolteacher named Asin Kadyrov organized the evacuation of Jewish children through the mountains while simultaneously serving as a translator for the Einsatzgruppe. He saved 43 children. He signed the execution lists of 400 adults. After the Red Army returned, he was deported with his entire people to Central Asia. He died in a settlement near Tashkent in 1957. No one ever knew which crime weighed heavier on his soul, the one he committed or the one he prevented. These are the forgotten ones, not the marble statues in the city squares, but the people who lived in the gray. They were neither devils nor saints. They were human beings trying to survive a war that gave them no clean choices. In the Carpathian Mountains, a Hungarian artillery captain named István Nagy received orders in October 1944 to shell the city of Debrecen after it had already been abandoned by the Germans. His own family lived there. He turned his guns toward the advancing Soviets instead. His regiment was wiped out almost to the last man. István survived, was captured, and spent 10 years in the Vorkuta camps. When he returned home in 1956, he learned that his disobedience had saved 2,000 civilians, including his wife and daughter. Debrecen still has a small street named after him, but the plaque says only to the memory of those who fell defending the city. No one mentions he was fighting on the wrong side. Closer to the end, in April 1945, a 19-year-old German nurse named Elizabeth Potulsky was stationed in a field hospital near Königsberg. When the Soviet assault began, the hospital was abandoned by its officers. Elizabeth stayed with 200 wounded men who could not walk. She negotiated their surrender herself, speaking the little Russian she had learned from prisoners. The Soviet commander, Colonel Grigory Shinkarev, gave his word they would be treated humanely. The next morning, soldiers under his command executed every German who could not stand. Elizabeth was raped and left for dead. She survived by hiding under corpses for 3 days. After the war, she married a Polish forced laborer and lived quietly in Gdansk until 2009. She never spoke German again, not even to her children. These stories were dangerous. In the Soviet Union, to speak of desertion, collaboration, or mercy shown to the enemy was to invite arrest. In the West, the narrative required clear villains and shining heroes. The truth was Messier, and so it was buried with the dead. But the dead do not stay quiet forever. In 1991, when the archives began to creak open, researchers found boxes labeled of no historical value. Inside were thousands of investigations that had been closed without conclusion, testimonies that contradicted the official line, letters from mothers begging for information about sons listed as traitors when they had, in fact, died performing acts of extraordinary courage. One such file concerned a Ukrainian auxiliary policeman named Dmytro Nadev, executed by the NKVD in 1944 for collaboration. The charge was true. He had served in the Schutzmannschaft. What the file did not mention was that Dmytro used his position to smuggle weapons to the UPA, the Ukrainian insurgent army, and personally led 27 Jews out of the Kolomia ghetto the night before its liquidation. He was betrayed by a rival faction within the UPA who wanted his weapons for themselves. His last request before the firing squad was to be shot facing his executioners. The request was denied. These are not exceptions. They're the rule that was never written down. The war produced millions of these fractured lives. Some carried their secrets to the grave. Some whispered them on their deathbeds to grandchildren who were too young to understand. A few, very few, wrote them down and hid the pages in walls, in attics, in the lining of old suitcases. Tonight, we begin to open those suitcases. What you're about to hear in the next part did not happen to faceless statistics. It happened to people who had favorite songs, who remembered the smell of their mother's cooking, who once believed the world made sense. They were betrayed by history twice, first by the war itself, and then by those who wrote the history books. Stay with me. The second part will take us into the very heart of the silence, into villages where neighbors denounced neighbors, into forests where boys became old men in a single winter, into hospital wards where mercy and murder shared the same corridor. Because someone has to remember them, not as heroes or traitors, but as human beings who tried, in the darkness, to remain human. The village was called Staryi Zadov, 30 kilometers west of Zhytomyr. In the spring of 1942, the Germans turned the local school into a transit camp for Soviet prisoners of war. 15,000 men passed through those doors in 4 months. Fewer than 2,000 walked out alive. The rest died of hunger, typhus, or a bullet behind the stables. One of the guards was a local boy, Mykola Kovalenko, 19 years old, drafted into the auxiliary police because he spoke a little German from school. Mykola's job was to stand at the gate and count the dead every morning. One dawn, he recognized his own older brother among the corpses. The brother had been captured near Kiev 6 months earlier. Mykola was ordered to throw the body onto the cart like the rest. He did it. That night, he stole a rifle, shot the German commandant in the throat, and disappeared into the forest. The Germans burned Staryi Zadov in retaliation. 47 civilians were locked in the church and burned alive. Mykola watched from the tree line. He never forgave himself. After the war, he lived under a false name in Donetsk, worked as a coal miner, and drank himself to death in 1968. His daughter only learned the truth in 2014 when a neighbor brought her a photograph. Mykola, in police uniform, standing next to the commandant he later killed. 50 kilometers away, in the same spring, a Soviet partisan commander named Captain Alexei Belarus received orders from Moscow to liquidate a village suspected of feeding German patrols. The village was Ukrainian, the same as his own men. Alexei rode in at night, looked at the children sleeping in the straw, and refused. He was arrested by his own commissar, accused of nationalism, and shot 2 days later in a clearing. The village was burned anyway by another detachment. After the war, the clearing was plowed under and turned into a collective farm field. No marker, no file. Only the old women remembered the captain who cried before he said no. These were not rare moments. They happened every week, every day, in hundreds of places whose names never reached the history books. In the forests near Narva, Estonia, a company of Estonian soldiers in German uniforms defected to the Red Army in February 1944. They brought with them 3 tanks and the exact positions of the German artillery. The Soviets welcomed them, photographed them for propaganda, then quietly sent the officers to the camps because they had once worn the wrong uniform. One of them, Lieutenant Harold Rattel, spent 11 years felling timber above the Arctic Circle. When he came home in 1955, his wife did not recognize him. He lived another 30 years and never once spoke about the forest, the tanks, or the promise that was broken. Further south, in Transnistria, a Romanian medical orderly named Ion Petrescu kept a diary on cigarette paper. Every night, he wrote the names of the Jewish patients he managed to move from the death ward to the typhus ward, where they had a chance. He saved 312 people this way. When Odessa was liberated, he was arrested as a Romanian war criminal. The NKVD major who interrogated him found the diary, read one page, and burned it in the stove. Ion got 25 years. He died in 1953 in a camp near Vorkuta. The major kept the lighter Ion had used to warm his hands during interrogations. His grandson still has it. Sometimes the betrayal came from the very top. In March 1945, near Lake Balaton in Hungary, the German 6th SS Panzer Army launched its last major offensive. Among the Hungarian troops forced to fight alongside them was a battalion of Jewish labor servicemen, unarmed men in civilian clothes, used as human mine detectors. When the attack collapsed, the SS began shooting the survivors. One Hungarian officer, Captain Georgi Carey, ordered his men to open fire on the SS instead. 37 Jewish laborers survived because of him. Carey was hanged from a meat hook in Budapest in April 1945 by the Arrow Cross militia. After the war, the Soviet authorities classified his action as an internal affair of the fascist forces and refused to recognize any victims or rescuers. The 37 men scattered across the world. Only one ever spoke publicly in Montreal in 1989. By then, almost no one was left alive who remembered the captain's name. And sometimes the silence was enforced by those who should have been the first to speak. In a village near Rivne, a Catholic priest named Father Andrei hid 11 Jewish children in his bell tower for 18 months. When the front passed, the children were handed over to Soviet authorities as orphans of unknown origin. The priest was arrested for collaboration because he had once given the Germans a list of parishioners who owned radios. He spent 9 years in Kazakhstan. The children were sent to orphanages and told never to mention where they had been hidden. One of them, a girl named Ruth, now lives in Haifa. She only found Father Andrei's grave in 2018. The stone reads only Priest A. Komik, 1902 to 1971. Nothing else. These are not stories of monuments. These are stories of people who were punished for being decent, rewarded for being cruel, and forgotten for being complicated. The war ended 78 years ago, but for many families it never ended at all. The questions still sit at kitchen tables. Why did grandfather have 2 medals and a prison number? Why did grandmother burn all the photographs from 1943? Why did Uncle Ivan never drink with the other veterans? Because the truth was dangerous then, and for a long time after. But the old are leaving us now. The last witnesses are in their 90s and hundreds. Soon the suitcases will be opened by grandchildren who never heard the stories, who will find letters in languages they cannot read, medals with numbers filed off, photographs with faces scratched out. This is the last chance to listen. In the final part, you will meet the woman who carried a German officer's child to term, because it was the only way to keep her village from being burned. You will meet the Soviet pilot who deliberately crash-landed in German territory to save the civilians his squadron had been ordered to bomb. You will meet the German deserter who lived 40 years in a Belarusian village under the name of a man he buried with his own hands. Their names were erased from every book, every memorial, every song. But they were here, and they mattered. Stay until the end. Someone has to carry their names a little further. The snow fell thick on the night of January 9th, 1944 in the village of Karasin, Zhytomyr Oblast. A German lieutenant named Heinrich Lang, 26 years old, knocked on the door of a widow named Alina Shevchuk. He was drunk, half-frozen, and carrying a bottle of schnapps and an order. If the village did not deliver 10 more men for labor in Germany by morning, the entire place would be burned. Alina was 31, alone with a 6-year-old son. She let the lieutenant in, poured him tea, listened to him cry about his dead brother at Stalingrad, and 9 months later gave birth to a daughter with light eyes. The village was never burned. Alina named the girl Maria and told everyone the father had been a Ukrainian partisan killed near Vinnytsia. Heinrich was killed 3 weeks later by his own side for refusing to shoot hostages. Alina carried the secret for 79 years. Maria learned the truth only in 2023, when she was 80, from a letter Heinrich had written the night he left and which Alina kept sewn inside a pillow. Maria now visits 2 graves, one in Karasin for her mother and one in a German war cemetery near Kyiv for a father she never met. She leaves flowers on both. 300 kilometers to the north, on August 12, 1943, Senior Lieutenant Yevhen Stakov took off from a dirt strip near Kursk in a battered IL-2. His orders were simple: flatten the village of Sin because German staff officers were supposedly hiding there. Yevhen flew low, saw women harvesting potatoes, children chasing a dog, smoke from chimneys. He turned the plane toward a nearby forest, cut the engine, and crash-landed in a clearing held by the Germans. He burned his orders, surrendered, and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp near Hamelberg. The village of Sin still stands. After the war, Yevhen was sentenced to 10 years for treason. He served 6, came home in 1954, and worked as a mechanic in Cherkasy. He never flew again. The villagers never knew who saved them. Yevhen died in 1991. His grandson found the burnt fragment of the map with Sin circled in red only last year. And then there was Klaus Neumann, a 20-year-old grenadier from Bremen who deserted near Mogilev in July 1944 after his company shot 30 Belarusian children for partisan activity. Klaus walked east instead of west, buried his paybook and rifle, and knocked on the door of a lonely forester's hut. The forester, Ivan Petrovich, had lost 3 sons to the war. He took Klaus in, taught him Belarusian, and when the Red Army came, registered him as his dead nephew Mikolai, who had supposedly returned from forced labor in Germany. Klaus Mikolai married Ivan's niece, raised 4 children, worked as a beekeeper, and spoke German only once in 56 years, when his eldest son brought home a bride from Minsk who turned out to be half German. Klaus cried, hugged the girl, and said in German, "You have your grandmother's eyes." Then he never spoke the language again. He died in 2000 at the age of 76. The village still argues whether Mikolai the beekeeper was really Belarusian or not. They buried him under the name on his Soviet passport. Only the bees know the truth. These were not rare stories. They were ordinary stories, repeated in 1,000 villages, forests, and cellars. The woman who fed the German sentry so he would look the other way while her husband escaped with the partisans. The partisan who shot the German sentry so the woman would not be hanged the next morning. The boy who guided a column of Jewish refugees through the marshes and then enlisted with the Waffen-SS because they promised to spare his mother. The mother who denounced her own son to the Gestapo because he had joined the partisans and she feared for the younger children. Every one of them carried 2 lives, the one they lived in daylight and the one they hid until the grave. Now the last of them are going. In a small flat in Lviv, 98-year-old Sofia Dmytruk keeps a cardboard box under her bed. Inside, a yellow star, a tiny Soviet pioneer tie, and a German Iron Cross with the ribbon cut off. She was a courier for the Home Army, then arrested by the Gestapo, then freed because she agreed to work as an interpreter, then freed again by the Red Army, who thought she was a victim. She was all of those things and none of them. She never married. Every year on May 8th, she puts on the pioneer tie, walks to the Hill of Glory, and stands there for exactly 7 minutes, neither celebrating nor mourning, just remembering the 7 people she personally saw die because of decisions she made before breakfast. She has outlived every witness. When she is gone, the box will go to a museum that will label the items, but will never explain why they were kept together. This is the final warning. When the last witness dies, the war will finally win. Not the war of armies, but the war against memory. The tidy stories will remain. Heroes in stone, villains in documentaries, dates on calendars. The gray will be painted over forever. But as long as one person still carries a secret too heavy to speak aloud, the war is not finished. Hannah, the old woman from the first minutes of this story, finally spoke in April of this year. She is 99 now. She called her great-granddaughter, asked her to come with a voice recorder, and spoke for 4 hours. She told about the German officer she shot in the back of the head in 1943 to save her sister. She told about the Jewish doctor she betrayed the following spring because he knew too much. She told about the child she drowned in the river because it was born with the face of the enemy and the village would have killed them both. Then she asked for tea, fell asleep, and never woke up. The recording is 23 gigabytes. The great-granddaughter does not know what to do with it. She is afraid to listen again. She is more afraid not to. So I will say it once, clearly, for all of them. They were not heroes. They were not traitors. They were people who tried to stay alive and stay human when both things were criminal offenses. Remember them without statues. Remember them without judgment. Just remember them, because soon there will be no one left who can. And when the last secret is buried with the last witness, the forgotten will finally disappear. Don't let them.